Everything you were taught about the Persians might be wrong. Their blood tells a story their empire never did. Before we go further, do something small for me. If you've ever felt like your own story was told wrong by someone else, stay to the end of this one. It might hit closer than you expect. For thousands of years, we have pictured the Persians a certain way. Golden thrones, endless armies, kings who thought they were chosen by the heavens. We picture Cyrus the Great riding into Babylon like a conqueror wrapped in mercy. We picture Darius commanding an empire so massive it stretched from Egypt to India. We picture Xerxes standing at the edge of Greece, sure that history belonged to him. This is the version we all grew up with. Persia, the first superpower. Persia, the empire of kings. Persia, the ancient rival of Greece and Rome, painted in our movies as exotic, powerful, and almost mythical. But here is the question nobody used to ask. Who were the Persians, really, before they became an empire? Not the kings, not the armies, not the palaces carved into mountains, the actual people. Where did their blood come from? Where did their ancestors walk before they ever picked up a sword? For centuries, we only had old texts and broken pottery to guess with. Historians pieced together stories from stone carvings and ancient scrolls, and they built a picture that felt solid enough. But stone can be carved to tell a story a king once remembered. Scrolls can be written by winners, and winners always shape the truth to make themselves look bigger, older, and purer than they really were. Then science stepped into the picture. Not war, not politics, just quiet laboratories, old bones, and something almost impossible to lie to. DNA. And what the DNA has started to reveal is not the simple, glorious bloodline people expected. It is something far stranger, far more human, far more complicated. It suggests that the story of the Persians may not have started the way the empire wanted us to believe. Let's start with the version most people know, the common story. According to popular history, the Persians came from a group of people called the Aryans. Not the twisted, hateful meaning that word got dragged into much later in history, but its original meaning, an ancient word, simply describing a group of related peoples who spoke early Indo-European languages. These groups are believed to have moved from the northern grasslands, somewhere near Central Asia, and slowly spread out over thousands of years. Some moved toward India, others moved toward the region we now call Iran. The traditional story says this migration gave birth to two great civilizations, the early Indian cultures and the early Persian cultures, both sharing ancient roots, ancient gods, and ancient language patterns. From these early Persian tribes came the Achaemenid dynasty, the family that built the first true Persian empire under Cyrus the Great around 2,500 years ago. This version paints the Persians as a proud, unified people, descending from a clear ancestral line, carrying old traditions forward into one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever seen. It feels neat. It feels believable. It feels like something written in a history textbook meant to close the chapter, not open new questions. But for a long time, nobody challenged this picture very hard. It matched the old writings. It matched what the empire itself claimed. Kings like Darius even left inscriptions bragging about their lineage, connecting themselves to noble ancestors and divine favor. Why would anyone question a story written in stone by the people who lived it? But here is where things start to shift. Ancient inscriptions were never neutral. They were propaganda carved by people who wanted to be remembered as chosen, superior, and destined for greatness. A king does not carve doubt into a mountain. He carves certainty. So slowly, quietly, researchers began wondering if the neat story of Persian ancestry might be more myth than fact. And that is when scientists turned to something that cannot be edited by kings. Bones, teeth, ancient skeletal remains buried deep beneath. The plains of Iran, some of them thousands of years older than the empire itself. This is where the real mystery begins. When scientists study ancient DNA, they are not just looking at random genetic code. They are looking at tiny fragments of information passed down through generations, fragments that can reveal where a person's ancestors truly came from, sometimes going back tens of thousands of years. It is like opening a diary that nobody was ever supposed to read, written not in language, but in biology. And when researchers began comparing ancient remains found across the Iranian plateau to remains from other parts of the ancient world, something surprising started to appear. The Persian bloodline was not one single clean line stretching back to one migrating group. It was a mixture, a blend, shaped by waves of different people arriving, settling, mixing, and disappearing into the land over thousands of years. Some ancient genetic material connected back to early farming populations that lived in the region long before any empire existed. Other traces connected to groups from the Caucasus Mountains, an area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, known for its rugged terrain and its history of moving cultures. And still more traces suggested waves of Central Asian steppe ancestry arriving at different points in time, not as one single event, but as multiple separate waves stretched across centuries. In other words, the Persians were never simply one people descending in a straight, pure line. They were something more complicated, more human. A patchwork stitched together over thousands of years by countless different groups meeting, mixing, fighting, and eventually blending into the land we now call Iran. If you feel your view of history quietly shifting right now, you're not alone. Type the word blend if this is already changing how you see the ancient world. Now here is where the mystery deepens even further. If the Persian bloodline was already mixed long before the empire, then the very idea of a pure Aryan homeland sitting neatly in one place, waiting to expand outward, starts to fall apart. This is a bigger deal than it sounds. For centuries, historians assumed there was a single point of origin, one ancestral group that eventually split into Indian and Persian branches. But the deeper scientists dig into the region's ancient remains, the more it looks like the Iranian plateau was already a crossroads long before any migration story began. Think about what that actually means. The land that would eventually raise Cyrus the Great was not empty, waiting for a chosen people to arrive and build greatness. It was already alive with different communities, different bloodlines, different histories layered on top of each other like sediment in a riverbed. Farmers who had been growing crops there for thousands of years, traders moving through mountain passes, small kingdoms rising and falling long before anyone had ever heard the word Persia. And when new groups did arrive from Central Asia, from the steppe, from other directions across many centuries, they did not erase what came before. They mixed with it. They married into it. Their children carried both ancestries forward. Generation after generation, this blending continued until the population living on the plateau by the time of Cyrus was already a deep genetic mixture, not the pure bloodline the empire's own writings like to imply. This is where the human side of this story becomes so powerful. Because what the DNA is really telling us is not just about ancient migration patterns. It is telling us that identity itself, the thing empires build their pride on, was never as simple as one bloodline, one people, one pure ancestry. It never really is, for any nation, any empire, any group of people, anywhere on earth. But the mystery does not stop there. Because if the Persian people were already this mixed before the empire, that raises an even bigger, even stranger question. What did being Persian actually mean back then? Was it about blood at all, or was it about something else entirely? Here is a soft moment to pause and really sit with that question. If your own family tree stretched back far enough, do you think it would stay neatly inside one country, one culture, one bloodline? Or would it start branching out into places you never expected? Comment the word roots if that thought stayed with you. Let's go deeper into what the ancient world actually looked like before Cyrus built his empire. Long before Persia became a name people feared and admired, the Iranian plateau was home to smaller kingdoms and cultures with their own identities. One of the most important was Elam, an ancient civilization centered in what is. Start branching out into places you never expected? Comment the word roots if that thought stayed with you. Let's go deeper into what the ancient world actually looked like before Cyrus built his empire. Long before Persia became a name people feared and admired, the Iranian plateau was home to smaller kingdoms and cultures with their own identities. One of the most important was Elam, an ancient civilization centered in what is now southwestern Iran. Elam existed for thousands of years before the Achaemenid Persians ever rose to power. It had its own language, its own writing system, its own gods, and its own long, complicated history of rivalry and cooperation with Mesopotamia, the land of early civilizations like Sumer and Babylon. Here is something that southwestern Iran. Do you think it would stay Elam existed for thousands of years before the Achaemenid Persians ever rose to power, or would it start branching out into places you never expected? Gods, comment its own long, complicated history of rivalry and cooperation. Let's go deeper into what the ancient world, the land of early civilizations Cyrus built his empire in Babylon. Long before Persia, something that a name gets left out of a simple version of Persian history. The Iranian plateau was home to the early Persian kings began building their empire. They did not erase Elamite culture. They absorbed it. An ancient civilization. Persian administration borrowed heavily from Elamite systems. Persian art borrowed styles that had existed in the region for centuries before any so-called Aryan migration arrived. Some of the very foundations that made the Persian Empire function smoothly, taxation systems, record-keeping, artistic traditions, were built on top of older civilizations that had already mastered these skills long before Cyrus was. Persian art borrowed styles that had existed in the region for centuries before any so-called Aryan migration arrived. Some of the very foundations that made the Persian Empire function smoothly, taxation systems, record-keeping, artistic traditions, were built on top of older civilizations that had already mastered these skills long before Cyrus was born. This means the empire we call Persian was never a story of one people arriving and building something entirely new from nothing. It was a story of layers, old civilizations blending with newer arrivals, old languages influencing new ones, old bloodlines mixing with new bloodlines. The empire that would eventually challenge Greece and dominate the ancient world was, at its core, a beautiful, complicated mixture of everything that came before it. And this is where the DNA evidence becomes even more fascinating, because it lines up with this layered picture almost perfectly. Genetic studies on ancient remains from the region show exactly this kind of long, slow blending, stretching back thousands of years before the empire's official founding. There was no single dramatic moment where one pure group swept in and became the Persians. There was a long, quiet, human process of mixing that took place over an enormous span of time. Some researchers studying these ancient genetic patterns believe this blending happened in multiple distinct phases, not one clean event. Early farming populations laid the first genetic foundation. Later arrivals from the Caucasus region added new layers. Even later movements from Central Asian steppe cultures added still more layers on top of that. By the time Cyrus the Great stepped onto the stage of history, the population beneath him was already the product of thousands of years of human movement, mixing, and adaptation. This is not a weakness in the Persian story. If anything, it makes it more remarkable, because it means the empire that rose to challenge the greatest powers of its time was built not on some mythical pure bloodline, but on the shared strength of many different peoples who had learned, over centuries, how to live together, adapt together, and eventually build something enormous together. But there is still a piece of this puzzle we have not touched yet, and it might be the most emotionally powerful piece of all, because if the Persian identity was never really about pure blood, then what tied these different groups together into one recognizable culture? What made someone Persian if their ancestors came from farming villages, mountain regions, and steppe migrations, all mixed into one bloodline? The answer researchers keep circling back to is something less physical and far more human. Language, shared belief systems, shared stories, shared loyalty to a growing political and cultural identity that people chose to belong to, generation after generation. This changes everything about how we should think about ancient empires, and honestly, how we think about identity itself, even today. If this idea is starting to feel bigger than just ancient history, you are seeing exactly what this story is really about. Share this with someone who has ever felt torn between more than one identity. They will understand this on a deeper level than most. Now let's step back and look at the empire itself, because once you understand this blended, layered ancestry, the entire achievement of Persia becomes even more incredible. Cyrus the Great did not build his empire by imposing one single culture onto everyone he conquered. Historical records, along with what we now understand about the mixed population beneath him, suggest something remarkable for its time. Cyrus allowed conquered peoples to keep their own religions, their own customs, and in many cases their own local rulers, as long as they accepted Persian authority and paid tribute to the empire. This approach was almost the opposite of what many ancient conquerors did. Where other empires tried to erase local identities and force conformity, the Persian Empire, built on top of its own already blended population, seemed to understand something powerful. Different peoples could exist together under one larger structure without needing to erase who they were individually. Some historians believe this understanding may have come naturally from the plateau's own history. A land that had already absorbed so many different groups over thousands of years may have shaped a ruling class that saw diversity not as a threat, but as something that could be managed, organized, and even strengthened through unity rather than forced sameness. This is one of the reasons the Persian Empire grew so massive so quickly. It was not just military strength. It was psychological and cultural strategy, built, whether consciously or not, on a foundation that already understood how to blend different peoples into something larger than any single group could be alone. Think about the Cyrus cylinder, an ancient artifact discovered in the ruins of Babylon. Many people describe it as one of the earliest known documents to discuss the treatment of conquered peoples, with a level of tolerance that felt unusual for its time. Some see it as an early symbol of religious and cultural freedom, even though historians debate exactly how far its promises extended in real practice. Now picture that artifact sitting on top of everything we just uncovered about Persian ancestry. A blended population, shaped by thousands of years of mixing, eventually producing a ruling philosophy that allowed conquered peoples to keep their own identities. It almost feels like the DNA and the history are telling the same story from two completely different directions. But let's slow down here, because history is rarely this clean, and the full picture is more complicated than a feel-good ending. The Persian Empire was not some perfect, peaceful haven of harmony. It was still built through conquest, through war, through the suffering of countless people who lost their freedom and their homelands to Persian expansion. Xerxes' invasion of Greece brought devastation. Persian rule over conquered regions still involved heavy taxation, forced labor in some cases, and the ever-present threat of military punishment for rebellion. The empire's tolerance existed alongside real brutality, real domination, and real human suffering. This is important to remember because uncovering a more complicated ancestry does not erase the darker parts of Persian history. It simply adds depth to a story that was never as simple as pure heroes building a golden age. Real history rarely offers clean heroes or clean villains. It offers complicated humans, shaped by complicated pasts, making choices that mixed cruelty and wisdom together in ways that are uncomfortable to fully accept. And this is exactly why the DNA discoveries matter so much. Because for centuries, certain versions of Persian history were used to support ideas of a pure ancestral bloodline. Ideas that, especially in more modern history, were twisted into dangerous nationalist and racial narratives far beyond ancient Persia itself. The word Aryan, born from these ancient migration studies, was later hijacked and horribly misused in the 20th century to justify some of the darkest chapters in human history. This is part of why real careful scientific research into ancient ancestry matters so deeply today. Because when the actual evidence is uncovered patiently, carefully, without political agenda, it almost always reveals something far more complicated, far more human, and far less convenient for those who want to use ancestry as a weapon for superiority. The DNA does not support the idea of one pure bloodline sweeping across the world and founding great civilizations alone. It supports something far more honest: migration, mixing, adaptation, shared humanity, blending together over thousands of years, creating cultures that were never as simple or as pure as later stories like to claim. If this feels heavier than you expected, that is exactly the point. Real history often does. Let this sink in for a moment before we continue. Let's bring this back to something deeply personal, because this is not just about Persia. This is about every single person watching this video right now. If you traced your own ancestry back far enough, using the same kind of careful genetic research scientists used to study ancient Persian remains, you would almost certainly find the same thing: a blend, a mixture. Ancestors from different places, different backgrounds, different stories, all quietly merging together over generations until eventually they became you. This is one of the most powerful truths hidden inside this entire mystery. The idea of a completely pure bloodline, whether we are talking about ancient Persians or, frankly, almost any group of people from any part of the world, rarely holds up once real science gets involved. Human history has always been a story of movement, of meeting, of mixing, of borders shifting, and people crossing those borders again and again throughout thousands of years. The Persian Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world had ever seen, was not built by one pure people descending in a perfect, unbroken line. It was built by generations of humans coming together from different places, blending their bloodlines, their skills, their beliefs, and their stories into something greater than any single group could have created alone. And maybe that is the real lesson hidden underneath. Thousands of years of dust, stone carvings, and ancient bones. Greatness was never really about staying pure. It was about blending, adapting, and building something bigger together. Before we close this story, let's return to where we started. The kings, the armies, the golden thrones we picture whenever someone says the word Persia. Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes were real people, ruling a real, massive, powerful empire. Their achievements were real. Their conquests were real. Their impact on world history was undeniable, shaping trade routes, government systems, and cultural exchanges that still echo through history today. But underneath their crowns, underneath their carved inscriptions claiming divine right and noble bloodlines, their people, the everyday farmers, soldiers, traders, and families who made up the true backbone of the empire, carried something far more interesting inside their veins than any king's propaganda ever admitted. They carried thousands of years of human movement, human mixing, and human adaptation written quietly into their DNA, waiting patiently for modern science to finally listen. This is what makes this discovery so powerful. It does not diminish Persian history, it deepens it. It transforms the story from a simple tale of one great bloodline building an empire into something far more human, far more relatable, and honestly, far more impressive. Because building one of the greatest civilizations in ancient history out of a deeply mixed, blended population takes something even more remarkable than pure ancestry ever could. It takes the ability to unite different peoples, different histories, and different bloodlines into one shared lasting legacy. So the next time someone tells you a story about a pure ancestral bloodline, whether it is about ancient Persia or really any nation, any empire, any people throughout history, remember what the science keeps quietly proving again and again all over the world. Purity was never really the foundation of greatness. Blending was. And maybe that truth matters more today than ever before. Because in a world still divided by ideas of bloodline, nationality, and belonging, ancient DNA keeps whispering the same quiet, powerful message from thousands of years in the past. We were always more connected than the old stories wanted us to believe. If this story changed how you see ancient history, or even how you see your own identity, let it sit with you for a moment before you go. Some truths are not meant to be rushed past. They are meant to be carried with you. The Persians were never just one bloodline wearing a crown. They were thousands of years of human stories, quietly woven together, waiting patiently underground, until science finally learned how to listen.